Good evening, everyone, and thank you very, very much for being here. I would just like to use this opportunity to thank my institution, the University of Johannesburg, for support, funding, resources, etc., to get to the US and to get to the clock. But then also, I would like to thank Ronna Talgard-Ostheimer and her team for their support, for looking after me while I've been here in lovely Williamstown. So thank you very, very much. I would like to start by posing a few questions. This is a quote by Frantz Fanon, an activist, a psychiatrist, and a thinker of the 1950s and 1940s. And he wrote a number of books, very pertinent texts, based on the psychological impact of race. And basically what he does in this quote is compare the native town to the town of the oppressor. So what I would like to present, first of all, is one or two images that conjure up or bring certain ideas to the fore, and to draw parallels between the history of South Africa and the history of the US. The first image is that of a design or an urban plan for an apartheid city. Basically, in the center is the city, and around it with the W's would be white areas only. And the darker colored areas, or the medium gray, is for Indian or colored peoples. And then the darkest area would be for African peoples. And these are all highly segregated, controlled areas. In the second image, as you can see, it's an image from the US, and it was taken in Detroit in 1942. It says, "We want white tenants in our white community." So it looks at spatial politics and spatial segregation. This type of segregation permeated into various types of situations. So for instance, recreational spaces like beaches. This is an image from South Africa, and it says white area or blanke gebied, which is an Afrikaans phrase. And again, very similarly, in the US, let's say about 40 years prior, there's separate public spaces for white and colored peoples. Within the schooling system, this is an image from South Africa, but one could hardly say there's any difference with this image taken in West Memphis in 1948. The year 1994 marked the first democratic election in South Africa's history. This election saw the end of almost 45 years of white minority totalitarian reign under the apartheid regime. In total, 342 years of colonial rule had elapsed. Last year, South Africans celebrated the commemoration of a 2-decade democracy. Sadly, the celebrations will be countered by as many years of social degeneration, discord, and related malaise. These glaring social indicators are symptomatic of something amiss in our newly so-called post-apartheid nation. About 40 years earlier in the US, the civil rights movement marked a parallel event. After much struggle and many deaths, Black Americans were liberated from the clutches of the Jim Crow era. What remained after many, many years of oppression is vast economic, social, educational, political, and institutionalized disparities. Amongst other things, examples include severe racial polarization within law enforcement, which have often ended in dire consequences. In light of recent events, such as the Walter Scott shooting, which in fact happened this weekend in Charleston, and the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, in St. Louis during September 2014, there are resonances again in South Africa with the current Rhodes Must Fall campaign at the University of Johannesburg, at the University of Cape Town, sorry, and the Marikana debacle that occurred just outside the mining town of Rustenburg in September 2012, where many miners died. Currently, the South African government's major agenda on paper is to decrease the colossal gap and persistent inequalities in the civil, economic, and financial sectors. 80% of South Africa's population is Black, and 80% of South Africans are living below the poverty line. Examples of government interventions include the radical transformation of all areas of the education system, creating opportunities for employment, addressing housing, services, and infrastructural issues. In the US, more than half of Black families, 54.9%, and 70% of Black families headed by single mothers were living in poverty in 1959. Let me just get to the slide. Sorry, I can't multitask, so our slides are lagging behind. Black poverty rates reached their lowest levels in 2000, which was 38.6% and 21.2% respectively. Black poverty rates have been slowly increasing since reaching 25.7% for all Black families and 41.2% for Black families headed by single mothers, and this information is from the US Census Bureau. Given the visible pervasiveness and consequences of our shared histories of racial inequality, this idea of post-race or even post-apartheid seems to fall short in terms of its feasibility here and now. It is undoubtedly fundamental to focus on the corporeal inequalities and basic human needs of newly liberated peoples. However, it is equally important to tend to the psychological state of the nation. How do we even begin to address racist ideology of white supremacy and Black inferiority, as it persists and permeates every aspect of our daily life? In response to this question, the broader argument addressed in this presentation is that true redress and reconciliation, true equality, if this is what we desire, is only possible if principles of civil critical awareness or conscientization are integrated into the current transformation schemas. To this end, the idea is to probe the psychological effect of our shared experiences with colonial histories in both South Africa and in the USA. I speak out of concern that South Africa seems to be heading towards the proverbial post-race light at the end of the tunnel, with a giant few. That was hard, but we're very happy it's over. I base this inference on A, the reluctance of many to acknowledge the pervasive ill effects of apartheid and white supremacy that still persists today, and B, on trends in counter-arguments which stem from an unwillingness to face the political and institutionalized nature of this phenomena. These include arguments such as, you can't blame everything on apartheid and stop pulling the race card. This text further looks into some of the dangers of continuing along this trajectory, and lastly, begins to interrogate how art practice or art-related practices can act as a vehicle of conscientization towards addressing these sensitive problematics. The following piece unpacks post-apartheid and post-race, and the relationship of this idea of Black neurosis, which I've borrowed from Frantz Fanon, and violent explosions, the current violent explosions. The resentment takes us to a particular place, a zone of non-being, an extraordinary sterile and arid region, where Black is not a man, and mankind is digging into its own flesh to find meaning. This is a quote taken from Frantz Fanon's 2008 version of Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon writes from the position of the oppressed. a resentful inferior to the colonizer, and therefore a humiliated, subjectified, and dehumanized individual. His book, Black Skin, White Masks, is an account of lived experience within a racially oppressive anti-Black society. Zayuddin Sardar postulates in the foreword of Black Skin, White Masks that Fanon unpacks the psycho-existential complex between colonizer and colonized to bring into visibility as well as theorize the devastating effects of white supremacy on the Black psyche. This oppressor binary creates psychological damage on both sides of the oppressive divide, and this is according to Tabensky. According to Fanon, race-based socio-economic and cultural dispossession can be extended to a type of psychological colonization, which, when repressed, may result in psychic disorders such as neuroses. Subsequent to Fanon, and based on the same premise, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in his 1988 book, Decolonizing the Mind, argues that alongside the physical, material, and cultural dispossession of colonization, they manifest in parallel a deep-seated indoctrination, which he calls the colonization of the mind. As suggested by the title of Wa Thiong'o's book, the broader term colonization of the mind involves an acceptance of and a resignation to the mental habits of the colonizer. Derek Hook, in 2004, extends the mental condition to the South African context. Apartheid may be considered a particular variation of the basic politics and conditions of colonialism. He refers to Bertoldi, who claims that the same basic constructs of colonialism, that is politics, the politics and the conditions, apply to apartheid. Similarly, the South African or American Black neurosis becomes a variant of the original Fanonian psychic disorder. Given the aforementioned conditions of colonization pertaining to the acceptance and assimilation of a white supremacist mentality, decolonization would simply require that the colonized reject dominant ideologies. However, Amansium, Chudney Desai, and Ritzkus suggest that decolonization does not occur by simply refuting a deeply embedded inferiority complex. Instead, it is a process that seeks to reimagine and re-articulate power, change, and knowledge through a multiplicity of epistemologies, ontologies, and axiologies. So, left unaddressed, the aforementioned trauma related to the internalization of oppression remain hidden below the surface and may result in, like any neurotic condition related to violent acts, depression, anger, hatred, violent explosions, as the examples provided, paranoia, fear, anxiety, inferiority, distaste, lack of self-worth, to name a few. The next section, and this is an image from the riots in Ferguson, by the way. I'm sure you're familiar with it. The next section explores the concept of white neurosis. How do we move forward when racism in the past and present is negated? I would like to read a short excerpt from the text by Pedro Alexis Tabensky, a philosophy professor at the University of Rhodes. For one good method for preserving views which have no justification is to breathe thoughtlessness. To use a term which Arendt made famous in the context of exploring Eichmann's mind, or more generally, a blind compliance to the object. And the blindness is helped along by the high psychic cost of letting go of them. But not only blindness helps racism along. In authoritarian cultures, compliance often has coercive forces. Going against the white mainstream, even if one believes that is what must be done, may come at the cost of social exclusion, even at times motherly love. Shame becomes the cost of acceptance into the community, and two of the alternatives open to those who have chosen the path of shame rather than of social exclusion is either to live with the pain or to repress. And not surprisingly, shame was widespread during the apartheid regime in South Africa and the Jim Crow era in the US. So for Tabensky, the idea of selective blindness is the unwillingness to engage in or register the atrocities committed, either indirectly, that is historically, or by association with a group or otherwise directly. It is a preferred mental state, a type of repression, an often subconscious mechanism that avoids shame and guilt in order to encounter as little discomfort and external resistance as possible. One of Gallagher's main arguments in his paper entitled Colorblind Privilege, the social and political functions of erasing the color line in post-race America, is that colorblindness maintains white privilege by negating racial inequality, and that embracing a post-race colorblind perspective allows whites to imagine that being white or black or brown has no bearing on an individual's or a group's relative place in the socio-economic hierarchy. Drawing on interviews and focus groups conducted with white Americans from around the country, his research findings includes the following. Lawsuits are evidence that there is no discrimination. This is based on some of the statements during interviews with Gallagher. So people realize they cannot discriminate that way because you will have a lawsuit against you. This is quote unquote one of the subjects during the study. Another is the denial of white privilege based on the following quote: "There's no one holding them back." Then there's affirmative action seen as reverse discrimination. Again, based on a quote: "Why is it important, to forget about white people's rights?" Often group-based grievances are seen as racist, and the author bases it on quotes such as, "Why would you have to make such a big statement that pushes people away and that threatens people?" Not responsible for discrimination. They say that we have been oppressed. They have not. The students here at the university right now have not been oppressed. We are not responsible. Also, lastly, and there was a number of other findings from this study. If you're interested, I can give you the title of the paper after. The last that I thought was quite interesting and very, very important for the study was that colorblind as long as you are just like me. So I am colorblind as long as you are just like me. And this was based on the statement, yeah, you're Chinese because of the way your eyes are slanted, but you talk just like me, so you're just like me. And this is by Prof. Charles A. Gallagher from the Department of Sociology at Georgia State University. The rise of similar refrains is beginning to threaten South Africa's chances to actively and productively reconcile. This was noted by a US professor of journalism at the University of Texas. And he is part of the Department of Communication. Robert Jensen, in his article, "South Africa Isn't Post-Racial Either," published in Color Lines in June 23, 2009, his article shows that certain patterns emerged during his stay in South Africa, such as the trend in using the argument, "Oh, apartheid is over," and the call to dehistoricize race. So how do we move forward from here? The TRC, or Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, was established in 2000 to address human rights abuses during the apartheid period. And it provided a platform during the early 90s to address some of the major atrocities of the apartheid era. According to the Apartheid Archive, which is another project that still continues today, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has made a critical contribution to this process. However, given its tendency to focus on the more dramatic or salient narratives of apartheid atrocities, and the fact that it thereby effectively, albeit perhaps unintentionally, foreclosed the possibility of an exploration of a more quotidian but pervasive and no less significant manifestation of apartheid abuse, means that much of the details of apartheid racism had not been publicly acknowledged or assessed. The primary thesis that fuels my research is that art-based practices provide opportunities for conscientization or critical awareness in both the practitioner and the public. As noted above, selective blindness or color blindness is a destructive force that works to perpetuate hegemonic constructs. In response to this attempt to negate and the broader psychosocial issues amongst Black and white communities, the TRC succeeded by the IJR, which is the, let me just find the text, Institution for Reconciliation. I'm not sure what the acronym is for at the moment. And projects like the Apartheid Archive attempts to reflect, name, and understand the contemporary South African condition. In a similar vein, my own practice as artist, educator, and researcher aims to elicit some form of dialogue around racial trauma. In Art Practices Research, written by Graham Sullivan, who extends the process and outcomes of image production to firstly knowledge-seeking and secondly knowledge-yielding processes. Like any knowledge-seeking process, the creative production one begins with certain assumptions, which are later replaced by new perspectives and new understandings. It is through analyzing and interpreting the productive experience when confronted by continually transforming and renewing visual data that art images begin to reveal conscious and unconscious thought. It is the understanding of this that assists in generating complex ideas. Creative production provides a dynamic and intimately engaged method to investigate, assimilate, and analyze sociological research areas and theories. In other words, Graham Sullivan argues for art production and art-based research as a form of praxis. Based on my personal experiences and encounters with race, my practice as an educator, artist, and writer has evolved and merged, and will now form the basis of an educational model that I will interrogate further during PhD studies. The idea is to use these modalities to elicit decolonization or conscientization and catharsis, perhaps catharsis, through art-based practices. The three modes of my practice, which are intertwined, reflective, and critical, manifest as creative production. Art products, exhibits, educational material, workshops, talks, dialogues, and written material, which is published in journal articles and magazines. They allow and create opportunities for reflective and critical dialogue with a broad-based public. These forms may address a number of themes which include spatial politics, class structures, gender and sexuality, and racial disparities. In essence, this paper suggests that conscientization or decolonization can be achieved through art-based practices. It is in my view that the production of cultural objects, which include images and text, imbued with psychosocial and political meaning, is in essence a political act and a potential vehicle for activism. From beginning to end, from its conceptualization to its reflective stages, art production is a knowledge-yielding practice. Knowledge that could potentially challenge hegemonic ideology on personal and collective fronts. If activism, stripped to its simplest definition, and for this context, is to take action to effect social change, my initial questions are as follows. What kind of production-related knowledge would enable changes of this nature? What could the transformative consequences be? Can the gaining of personal, critical, and liberatory knowledge be considered an active act of activism, especially if an object of this process is to engage a public audience? In response to my emotionally charged initial reading of Fanon's Black Skin, White Mask, and this was many years ago, my idea was to use the creative production process to elicit, interpret, and process my own memories of life experiences within the apartheid and post-apartheid social setting. A further aim was to represent the use of encoded visual objects, my interpretations of memories around a theme of racial wounding, based on an action-reaction ontology. My own creative production process was driven by a twofold need, to evoke my own as well as a collective conscientization. The Aftermath exhibition was the first creative output based on the aforementioned model. This exhibition, which included sculptural installation, collaborative video work, and performance, sought to recontextualize, re-image, and visualize a personal and context-specific reading of Fanon's concept of Black neurosis. Throughout the exhibition, ideas are represented as abstracted sculptural, filmic, and performative forms. The sculptures are conceptually fundamental in the exhibition, and the elements around which the collaborative modalities, video and performance revolve. A second iteration is my latest curated show entitled Tension Torsion 20 Years On. And this was a responsive curatorial intervention that comprised an artwork of an art exhibition of new works by artists such as Gordon Froud, Avita Suful, Opa Makwena, and myself. So I would like to start the following section. These are images from the Aftermath exhibition, and this image specifically is based on geographic segregation, which still persists. This is a current image of a township outside of the Cape Town city center. And to juxtapose the other side of the city center, this again is a current image. So the disparity in terms of economic and financial difference that persists in South Africa today. So the work that is on at the moment is a representation of the very stark township based on apartheid, on the apartheid model. And this was the entire installation at the Apartheid Museum in 2012. The collaborators for this show was Tami Hector Manikehla, who's doing the performance on the other projector or other screen, and Moka Janse van Vieren, who is a film artist. We did the film works, which we will look at later in collaboration. So this is a quote by Paulo Freire, where he states, on the other hand, dialogue cannot exist without humility. The naming of the world through which people constantly recreate that world cannot be an act of arrogance. So the idea is that naming, understanding, reflecting, conjuring up memories, provoking memories is a way to move forward in terms of conscientizing or creating awareness amongst people of all races. Dialogue as the encounter of those addressed to the common task of learning and acting is broken if the parties, or one of them, lack humility. How can I dialogue if I always project ignorance onto others and never perceive my own? I will start with this work. The first work is entitled Ma, which directly translated from Afrikaans is mother. I would like to play this work before I start. I'll just play it one more time. Here, the visual narrative begins with a single narrow sheet of aluminum creeping into shot and towards the viewer, out of the frame. It moves alongside a stationary yellow measuring tape, positioned to the side. Before long, it becomes clear that as soon as the metal sheet touches the red line, which runs perpendicular to the tape, something noteworthy occurs. Once the affected section of metal crosses over the line, it settles and moves on. However, the strong links to domestic and industrial labor deepens the aforementioned race-class associations of this work. Nia, in her 2010 paper, asserts that Fanon's reading of Lelou's, a Martinican woman who worked as a laundress, was skewed. In his metaphorical analysis, he overlooks her social struggles and lack of autonomy and declares that her employment is out of self-interest. His assumption is that she wants to bleach her skin like the clothes she washes. Historically, South Africa's patriarchal colonial regime determined the limited employment and economic opportunities of all Black groupings. For women, this was particularly challenging, as the permutation of racial and gender subjugation led to extreme levels of internalized subordination, disempowerment, and poverty. The intent behind this work was to explore lifetime and intergenerational perpetuation of trauma lived and passed on via the mother. More specifically, the idea was to focus on our vicarious experiences or life-changing moments in our own histories with our mothers. This work is accompanied by a sculptural piece, which is a result of the animation, stop-motion animation process. The following video work is part of a triptych, 3 accompanying works placed in close proximity to one another in the installation, referencing the urban landscape and architectural construct. So the idea is to look at bodies and how the soma, or the bodies, or the physical body or visceral body is affected and controlled by specific regimes, laws, etc. And then also how the psychological traces are inscribed and remain. So the title of this work, the video work in particular, is Haste Palace, and it's based on a game which was originally Dutch and then passed on to what in South Africa is known as colored communities. Colored is mixed race, often very mixed, not black, white necessarily, but Malay, Indian, etc. So it's a complex hybridity. In the racial hierarchy, white peoples would be considered at the top of the hierarchy in terms of access to resources, living space, public spaces, employment, etc. And at the bottom of the hierarchy was black, but in between there was colored, Indian, and Asian. So the title Haste Palace refers to a game, an Afrikaans game, that describes or kind of predicts where you would end up or what you could aspire to in life as either a white or colored child. The game goes Haste Palace Pondok Varkok. So that means house, palace, shanty, pigsty. And it is based on the number of buttons that you have on a shirt or on a jacket. So you would count Haste Palace Pondok Varkok, Haste, and that means you would end up living in a house. So the idea around this work is based on class structure, looking at a variety of living spaces or abstract depictions of those living spaces. The rest of the work shown at the top of the slide is titled This Is My Home Now. And This Is My Home Now consists of 60 modular components stacked in geometric formations on a low plinth on the floor. It illustrates the bodies, forms, constructs, and spaces within a formally controlled residential township that maintains all evidence of inscription, any physical indications or memories of a history long past. The experience of internal displacement is an extraordinary life experience, often shared collectively, and is capable of causing any person a wide range of physical and psychological suffering and disabilities. This work is based on my own hometown called Mitchell's Plain, a vast, self-contained township designated for coloreds only by apartheid legislation in the early 1970s. My family was relocated from a place called Parkwood in 1976. The installation represents the memories and the struggle of forced removals and people's subsequent internal displacement under the Group Areas Act 41 of 1950. Fanon's observations on race, class, spatial segregation are applied here, focusing specifically on the division of land, property, infrastructure, and amenities, and the psychological impact thereof. The work further references more topical evictions, such as the recent relocations. So again, this idea of forceful removals persists. So such as the recent relocations of entire communities on the Cape Flats, more specifically the poverty-stricken Delft township during the early months of 2012. The title is taken as a direct quote from one of the residents of Delft, who mentioned that irrespective they were being moved, they would have to turn the new space into their home. And then finally, the performance that has been showing on the other projector screen. The performing artist is Tami Hector Manikehla, and he is an international performance artist. This work was entitled Performing the Aftermath. It is a playful exploration embodying an unseen, omnipresent oppressor. In retrospect, a play on Freire's The Oppressed Becomes the Oppressor. The visceral male body operating among static sculptural bodies and within a larger body of work or an installation inside the body, possessing that body and rendering the body a possession. Play, wreaking havoc, a force of destruction, are all interesting terms that the work conjures up. These are both deliberate and unconscious, and the extent of which the game is acting upon these sculptural bodies, which are representative of cold grey flesh, which is representative of spatial elements, as well as relationships and temporality. So to conclude, coming from a position that the repression of racial trauma is a problem for reconciliation and developing a true equality in both South Africa and the US, this paper suggests that the revelation of such repressed thoughts through dialogue, as suggested by Freire, but dialogue evoked by artworks, provocative artworks, though considered a highly uncomfortable venture, should be reconsidered as a necessary discomfort. I suggest that the arts can offer a way to A, process related ideas, B, understand the problems and root causes, and C, provoke, evoke, and invoke dialogue where necessary. I would like to end with the question, what can we learn or unlearn? Thank you. Are there any questions? Or comments?
In the installation, there are people standing around watching, and I'm guessing that they're having a visceral response to what's happening in front of them, which I think is what you mean by art being activist, being conscientization, raising consciousness. Was there any dialogue, or did they ever get a chance to talk about what they were seeing, what they were feeling, how they were interpreting what was going on?
Yeah, in general, I consider my art practice to be also educational practice, my own and of the public, and it depends on how you would like to interpret the works. So every public engagement comes with dialogue. So at this specific time, once the performance is completed, there's a session up to an hour or two where people can provide responses, comments, share. And in my opinion, what artists do is to share information, very personal information. So it's a form of disclosure that happens. And automatically in these cases, because of the rawness of that disclosure, which in fact, disclosure is a psychological tactic. So in that process, audience members, viewers, people who engage with the work feel that they too should disclose something personal. And this is how the dialogue begins. I don't claim to have answers. That's why I finished with the question. And I am very interested in how much and how far we can prove that art has a positive effect on viewers and on artists in terms of decolonization and decolonizing ends. So, yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that was great. It would have been interesting. I would love to have heard the discussion about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
You made a comment about the choreographer, Nazier, using the unconscious plays an unconscious expression. And I wondered how your work aligns itself in that way in the construction or...
My own work kind of thrives on deliberateness. It starts off by being very deliberate. So the title of this specific exhibition was After Math, which is short for after mathematics. So there's a lot of planning, a lot of designing, a very conscious process of encoding material and then decoding as I go along. But the subconscious part always comes along in any case, because you can't tell what it's going to reveal. And this is, for me, how I learn from the art making process, is that you've assigned meaning to something, and then as that object performs the meaning, it reveals something new to you. So I can't plan every single action. I can plan the beginnings, and then move on from there and hope to discover something new and meaningful throughout the process. They do feel like toys. Yeah. It links to the idea of the mathematics part, links to the idea of apartheid being a very, very well planned, engineered regime, and how it filters down into the lives of people is not necessarily something that you could ever dream up or dream of. And if it's a dream, it's a nightmare, really. So I think in a similar way, my process tries to reenact that. It's like you begin with an amazing plan, but you never, I don't think, as horrific as we think these people were, I don't think they could ever imagine how it ended or how it still continues.
What has been the reaction of the public to this exhibit, and how have you captured those reactions?
There was a number of interventions with this exhibition. Firstly, this exhibition was an intervention in the Apartheid Museum where it was showing. And the Apartheid Museum shows a meta-narrative of facts and truths that the politics and policies of apartheid and how it kind of ended up affecting lives, etc. Though there's very few pieces that look at the personal processes and the personal lives of people. So firstly, it's an intervention in that. And then in terms of intervening in the public and how the public views apartheid, the work there was a public seminar that was organized by the museum, and that was recorded. There's transcripts available for those. There was a number of artist talks, which again is recorded. The recording helps for my own reflection as an educator, and my own ideas of how this can play a role in the broader scheme of things. The responses of the audience members were very interesting, of course. Because it's a museum setting, the audience members are not the general gallery goers. So it's people who are interested in history. And then if you throw something very personal and something very raw into the center of that, I think the responses were firstly quite surprising. Like, people were surprised, and I was surprised at what they were willing to share, because it really does become a group session of some sort where people reveal a lot of information that is quite uncomfortable. And even for me, I'm not a psychologist, nor am I a sociologist. I'm interested in those things. I don't know what to do if there's a cathartic process that begins to occur during these talks. And somehow the artworks really mediates that process. So we talk freely about our experiences, shared experiences, collective experiences, looking at forced removals. I think the amount of responses with this specific work that I spoke about, and especially with the work titled Ma, was overwhelming. Everybody has a mother, whether they know them or not, everyone has a mother. And the types of experiences, as I said, that was shared in this process left me quite uncomfortable at times. But the fact that people felt comfortable enough to have a dialogue in front of other members of the public was the first indicator to me that this process can become something bigger, and that people are trying to understand their own situations and the condition in which they live. Yeah. Mixed. I think demographically mixed. Look, in South Africa, the demographic is 80% Black and about 9% white, and the rest is colored and Indian. And I would say that the demographic was correct during the exhibitions. So, yeah. Yeah.
Would you situate your art within a particular movement, like Afro-pessimism or Afrofuturism?
You're the first person ever who's asked me this. Let me think. Good question. I wouldn't. I wouldn't situate my artwork in a particular movement because it might even be in between. I don't know if there's a word for that or a title for that, because it does look at the pessimistic, it does look at the negative, the dystopia, etc. But then it also has a playfulness, explorativeness about it that suggests hope, and suggests that there is a way to work through this, through exploring, through playing, through kind of walking the uncomfortable roads. Yeah. So I wouldn't position my work in either of those, no. Anyone else?
So it's so interesting to see how you work across media, and I'm wondering what have you learned by kind of crossing those boundaries, whether, working in your own metalwork and then performance art and animation?
I think, well, one can only learn a lot from, firstly, working in performance, working in metalwork. Metalwork is my comfort zone. And I realized very long ago that art is not a comfortable place. If it becomes comfortable, you're in trouble. You stop asking questions, you stop learning. Yeah. So I found that working across modalities in terms of medium, I've really kind of seen the potential of material and the potential of those modes, and also gotten into the minds of collaborators or partners in a way that I don't think anybody else would ever be able to. That's a type of intimate relationship that occurs that you won't even share with your lover, I promise. Because it really delves into the mind of the person who's creating that work. And then in terms of working myself across disciplines, working with text, working with education, and the production of artworks, in each iteration of the work, because I see them as different tools or different languages which I've learned to speak. Every single tool will give you a different effect. If I use a hammer, it will give me a different effect. If I use a sandblast, it'll give me, or a grinder, it'll give me a different effect. The same way, using text to reflect, using dialogue to reflect, will give me two different types of conclusions, or will evoke different ideas. I was just having a conversation with Rona earlier on to say that every time I speak about the work, speaking is somehow more honest than writing, because you can edit writing. If you've said something, you've said it. You can try and fix it, but it's already out there. Writing, however, you can tangibly, something becomes manifest. You can look at it You can see it, you can pull it apart, you can analyze it, it's there. And dialogue is a lot more ethereal than that. So each area or method comes with its own kind of problems and with its own positive aspects through which you learn a number of different things. And I think that as an educator, many years ago, I've decided that the only way to be an educator is actually to learn, to continue to learn.
With the people who saw this, was there some commonality of understanding what was going on? Or did you consider it something that would be subject to interpretation by each person? What? I don't know what was going on.
Sure.
So I just wonder if I was supposed to.
I think with images, one can assign any meaning. This is the beauty of images. So if I said to you that this was related to nature and the way in which nature is a destructive force, etc., 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 that would be the lens through which you would read something. So I think with abstract images, even more so. So the reason why I use abstract images is there's a number of them, but one of them is so that they are very much open to interpretation, so that you can read your own into the work. And yes, I do have my intentions and I have my own experiences with the forms. And for me, I allow other people to have those same experiences. Tinged by the underlying idea, they will always come back to some sort of related, broader concept. Because I've already encoded these objects with something, so it won't be outside of that scope. But they really are open to, I've had a lot of different interpretations, and I'm happy with all of them. I'm happy to hear them. I'm happy to see what other people see. And that, for me, in the public engagements is one of the most important things, because I learn from other people's experiences and they learn from mine.